Welcome to another tale of suspense and unease, where the ordinary transforms into something far more unsettling. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our next eerie story. And if you're already a part of this community, well, welcome back. I'm glad you are here to join me once again in a journey through the unknown. It was a typical Tuesday morning, the kind of day that felt ordinary, the sort of day that never hinted at anything out of the ordinary. The sun streamed through the blinds, casting warm streaks of light across the room. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping my coffee, the steam rising in delicate curls before vanishing into the air. It was quiet, peaceful, even though there was a sense of comfort in the simplicity of the morning. Another day, another dollar, I muttered to myself, almost laughing at how cliché it sounded. But that was the reality. I was just another delivery boy, navigating through life with nothing but the humdrum of daily routines to keep me company. My name's Ryan, and like many others, I worked for a small local pizza joint. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I found some strange comfort in the monotony of it all. As I stood up to grab my jacket, the soft sound of the radio played in the background. The news was nothing remarkable. There had been a couple of traffic accidents, a few crime reports here and there. Nothing that would make you pause or worry, just the usual. I glanced at the clock. 10:30 a.m. I had a few deliveries lined up for the day, nothing too hectic, the usual crowd, some office workers, a couple of families. Nothing to expect but the usual grumbles about being late or forgetting to add extra cheese. But today felt different somehow. It was hard to pinpoint, but there was an odd sense of anticipation hanging in the air. A strange quietness, almost like the calm before a storm. I chuckled aloud. "All right, time to get moving," I said to myself, shaking off the feeling. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. The streets were empty at this hour. The city was still waking up, the shops not yet open, the streets devoid of the usual hustle and bustle. It felt almost serene, as if the world had hit pause. I liked it that way. It gave me a chance to think, to clear my head. As I walked to my car, I couldn't help but notice how still everything seemed. Even the trees seemed to stand motionless, their branches barely swaying in the gentle breeze. Starting the car, I headed toward my first delivery of the day, a small apartment complex just a few blocks away. I knew the place well, having delivered there countless times. The residents were friendly enough. Some were regulars, others were just passing through. But all in all, it was a typical stop. The drive was smooth, almost too smooth. The kind of drive where your mind starts to wander, thinking about everything and nothing at all. I thought about the upcoming weekend, plans I hadn't yet made, and whether or not I'd get any sleep tonight after the long shift. It wasn't until I turned onto the street where the apartment complex stood that something caught my attention. There was a house on the corner, an old weathered building that I'd passed by countless times before. But today, for some reason, it felt different. The front door was ajar, just slightly, and there was no sign of life. No car in the driveway, no lights on in the windows. Just an empty, eerie quiet that sent a chill down my spine. I paused for a moment, unsure why I was even thinking about it. Maybe it was the quiet morning, or the way the house looked abandoned yet still lived in. The thought of it lingered in my mind for just a second too long. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease building in my chest. I had a job to do. Turning my attention back to the task at hand, I continued down the street. I parked in front of the apartment complex and grabbed the pizza bags, double-checking the addresses. The door to the building was unlocked, and I walked inside, the familiar smell of pizza dough and cheese filling the air. I took the elevator up to the third floor and knocked on the door. The person who answered was a middle-aged man, dressed in a button-up shirt and jeans, his face tired but friendly. "Hey, thanks for getting this here so quick," he said with a smile, taking the boxes from me. "You're a lifesaver." I smiled back, handing him the receipt. "No problem. Have a good day." It was a quick exchange, as most deliveries were, but as I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air around me felt thick, almost oppressive. It was as though something had shifted in the atmosphere. I dismissed it, of course. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let some strange feeling throw me off course. But as I walked back to my car, the odd sensation returned. I glanced around, looking for any sign of what was causing it. Nothing. Just the usual buzz passing by, people going about their day, the soft hum of the city. I got in my car and drove off to the next delivery, but the feeling stayed with me, lingering in the back of my mind. Something was wrong, but what? It was then that I noticed it. An odd mark on my rearview mirror, a small smudge, like something had brushed against it. I couldn't remember when I'd last touched it, and I certainly didn't recall anything unusual happening when I'd gotten into the car. I reached up and wiped it away, but the feeling didn't leave. It only grew stronger, gnawing at me, making my skin prickle. It was subtle at first, but I knew that something was about to change. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but I could feel it. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out what it was. The day wore on, but the unease never fully left me. Each delivery felt like a ticking clock, and I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that something wasn't quite right. My route had become a blur. Stop, deliver, move on, repeat. But each time I left the customer's doorstep, I felt the tension building in my chest. It was nearly noon when I arrived at my next stop, a small house on the edge of town. The street was quiet, almost too quiet. The houses here were spaced out, with tall trees lining the sidewalks, their branches swaying in the breeze. There was a strange stillness to the place, as if the entire block was holding its breath. I parked the car and grabbed the pizza bags, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The house I was delivering to was on the corner, its lawn neatly trimmed and its paint fresh. It looked like any other house I'd been to. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as I walked up the driveway, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a window on the second floor, just above the front door. The blinds were pulled halfway down, but through the crack, I could see movement. A shadow. Someone, or something, was standing there, watching me. I froze, my hand still on the door handle. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart pounded in my chest. Shaking off the feeling, I rang the doorbell. A few moments later, a woman opened the door. She was in her late 20s, dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans. She smiled at me, but there was something strange about it, a forced, tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, thanks for the delivery," she said, her voice too high-pitched, too cheerful. It didn't match the tension I could feel hanging in the air. I handed her the pizzas, my fingers brushing hers for just a moment. It was a brief contact, but it felt off, cold, like I had touched something that wasn't quite alive. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She nodded quickly, still smiling. "Oh, yeah, everything's fine, just a long day." I couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in her hands as she took the boxes from me, and the way her eyes darted around, never quite settling on me, as if she were looking for something, or someone else. "Well, enjoy your meal," I said, my voice a little quieter than I intended. I turned to leave, but as I stepped off the porch, I glanced back at the house. The window was empty now, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I shook my head again, trying to push the unsettling thoughts away. Maybe I was just overthinking things. It had been a long morning, after all, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong, that something was off. I got back in my car, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept wandering back to the house, to that fleeting shadow in the window, and to the woman's smile. Too wide, too strained. It wasn't until I was halfway to my next delivery that I noticed something else. A car was following me. At first, I thought it was just another coincidence, a driver on the same route, but the longer I drove, the more certain I became that the car was intentionally tailing me. It wasn't a particularly remarkable car, just a dark sedan, nothing special, but it had been behind me for the last few miles, and no matter how many turns I made, it stayed right there, keeping a consistent distance. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't normal. I had never been followed before, at least not like this. It wasn't like the usual drivers who turned off at the next intersection. This car just kept going, never veering off course. I tried to keep calm, focusing on the road ahead. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were heading in the same direction. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The van stopped, starting to play again. I took a sharp turn onto a side street, hoping to lose the car in the maze of residential roads. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it again. The same dark sedan, just behind me, like a shadow. I laughed. I couldn't stop the rising panic that bubbled up in my chest. I was being followed, and I didn't know why. I made another turn and then another, my heart pounding in my ears. The sedan was still there, still right behind me, never straying too far. It was like they were waiting for me to make a mistake, to reveal where I was going. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to get control of the situation. I had to shake this car off, get back to normal. I couldn't let this paranoia take over. I decided to drive straight to the police station. It was the closest place where I could be sure I'd be safe. If someone was following me, I needed help. As I neared the intersection that would lead to the station, I checked the rearview mirror one last time. The sedan was still there. But as I made the turn, I noticed something chilling. The car didn't follow me. Instead, it turned into a side street, vanishing from view. I drove to the police station, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind racing. I parked outside, glancing nervously around the area. There was no sign of the sedan anymore. Had it all been in my head? I didn't know. But one thing was certain. Something strange was happening, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever was coming next. Next. Exercised alongside the tangible experience, the police station felt strangely reassuring. It was quiet, almost too quiet for a place that should have been bustling with activity. I parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the building in front of me. My hands still trembled slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something bigger than just a strange encounter on my delivery route. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, locking it behind me. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting, but it did little to calm the growing unease inside me. I made my way toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the stillness of the empty street. The lobby was empty, save for a few officers behind the counter. A couple of them glanced up as I entered, but none seemed particularly interested in my presence. I approached the desk and cleared my throat, trying to shake off the nervousness that had settled in my chest. I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out a little too strained. I think someone's been following me. I don't know if it's just paranoia or what, but I thought I should report it. The officer behind the counter, a man in his 40s with graying hair, raised an eyebrow. Following you, huh? Where exactly? The confident man grinned at him. I explained everything. The deliveries, the strange feeling at the house, and the car that had been tailing me. He listened patiently, but there was a look in his eyes that made me wonder if he thought I was just another nervous delivery driver overreacting. Then he lowered the car to impatiently back to the road along the freeway and drove away from the lot. "Right, well, it could be nothing," he said after a moment. "People tend to get paranoid, especially when they're on the road all day. But if it happens again, don't hesitate to call us. We'll take a look." I nodded, feeling a bit deflated. I had hoped for more, some sort of reassurance, but it seemed like my concerns weren't taken seriously. The officer's tone was dismissive, as if he thought I was overreacting. "Thanks," I said, forcing a smile before turning to leave. But as I walked out of the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the officer had looked at me, like he didn't believe me, had made me feel even more alone in this. I returned to my car and drove back to my route, trying to push the encounter with the sedan out of my mind. But as I passed the familiar streets, a nagging thought kept circling in my head. What if the officer was right? What if I was just imagining things? I faced the same reality again. Every day, fear scurried like a little voice out of my head and whispered to be smaller. "Man, it's far too ugly to contemplate." But then, as I turned onto the next street, I saw it again. The dark sedan. It was parked at the corner, just out of sight, its headlights off, the engine idling quietly. I felt my heart race in my chest, and a chill ran down my spine. The car had been waiting for me, like it knew exactly where I would be. Darkness in the dark hollow end of the summit of Mount Dominique Grove. I quickly made a sharp turn, hoping to lose it, but when I checked the rearview mirror, the sedan had followed me again. It was just behind me, moving in sync with my every turn, its headlights cutting through the darkness like an ominous warning. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whoever was behind that wheel wasn't just following me by accident. They were tracking me. And I had no idea why. My thoughts raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Was it a prank, a coincidence, or was something more sinister going on? I tried to shake the fear from my mind, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. I had to find out who was behind the wheel of that car. I couldn't let this go. I decided to take a risk. I sped up, hoping to outrun the sedan. But no matter how fast I drove, it stayed right behind me, always a few car lengths away. It was like I was in a game of cat and mouse, and I was the prey. As I approached an intersection, I slammed on the brakes, swerving to the side and hoping the sedan would pass me. But when I glanced back, the car was still there, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It had slowed down, waiting for me to make a move. I had no choice. I had to confront this head-on. I turned sharply onto a side road, my tires screeching as I made the maneuver. The sedan followed, its engine roaring as it sped up to match my pace. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my pulse racing, and saw something that made my blood run cold. The driver's seat was empty. The car was still following me, but there was no one behind the wheel. I slammed my foot on the gas, heart pounding in my ears, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The car was still there, its headlights shining bright, but there was no one driving it. I could feel my breath quicken, panic rising in my chest as I pushed the pedal to the floor. I had to get away. I had to get... And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sedan disappeared. The headlights flickered out, and the car vanished into the night, leaving me alone on the dark road. I didn't stop to think. I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, faster and faster, until I reached a part of town where the street lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the road. I pulled over to the side, my hands still shaking, my heart still racing. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. Whoever, or whatever, was behind that car wasn't human. And it was watching me. I parked the car at the edge of the street, my fingers still gripping the wheel as if it were the only thing holding me together. The adrenaline from the chase still buzzed through my veins, but now it was mixed with a heavy, suffocating fear. The air around me felt thick, like something was closing in, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone. Couldn't explain what had happened with the sedan. It was as if the car had been driven by something other than a person, something unseen, something unnatural. The absence of the driver was haunting, but the feeling that I was being watched, that was what truly unsettled me. My skin prickled with the sense that I wasn't just dealing with an ordinary stalker. This was something far worse. I glanced around the empty street, the silence almost oppressive. There was no sign of the sedan, no indication that anything unusual had even happened. Yet, the events from just moments ago felt far too vivid to ignore. My mind raced, replaying every moment, every turn, every eerie detail. How had the car moved so precisely? Why had it followed me so relentlessly? And most importantly, why had it vanished without a trace? I could feel the questions weighing me down, each one a reminder of how little I truly understood about what was going on. But there was something else in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite place. It was like a whisper, just beyond my comprehension, but it kept pushing its way forward. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the sedan again. But instead, I saw something much worse. A figure stood in the shadow of the alleyway behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I blinked and focused, I saw the shape more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with broad shoulders and a posture that was unnervingly stiff. The figure didn't move, just stood there, its outline barely visible in the dim light of the street lamp. My breath caught in my throat. I had to look away, but my eyes were drawn back to the figure. It was like my body couldn't stop staring, as if it was being compelled to witness something it shouldn't. I quickly glanced around the car for something, anything to defend myself with. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the door handle, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was still there, standing motionless, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then started the engine with a roar, my foot pressing hard on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as I sped away from the alley. I didn't look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had been following me, just like the sedan. I drove for what felt like hours, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The city passed by in a blur of lights and shadows, each turn I took only increasing my paranoia. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that tall figure trailing behind me, but the road remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just out of sight. Eventually, I found myself back in familiar territory, close to my apartment. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I parked the car. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten here. It was as if I had been on autopilot, unable to stop myself from driving, from fleeing whatever was following me. But now that I was here, I couldn't bring myself to get out of the car. The silence in the car was deafening, and the darkness around me seemed to close in, pressing against the windows. I sat there, staring out at the parking lot, my mind spinning with thoughts of the figure, the sedan, the feeling of being watched. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I gathered enough courage to step out of the car. My legs were unsteady, and the world around me felt surreal, like I was walking in a dream. I hurried toward the entrance of my building, constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. As I reached the door, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the far end of the parking lot, was the sedan. It was parked at an odd angle, facing my apartment building. The headlights were off, but I could see the faint outline of the car's shape in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Despite my weakened state in front of the controls, flick of the headlights told me that it was true. The car had followed me here. I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, but there were no answers. I couldn't run. I couldn't hide. I had nowhere to go. The sedan remained still, like a dark sentinel watching over me, waiting for me to make the next move. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. In the reflection of the building's windows, I could see the faintest movement inside the car. A shadow, and was shifting just behind the windshield, like someone, or something, was sitting in the driver's seat. I couldn't take it anymore. Panic surged through me, and I turned toward the entrance, my heart pounding in my chest as I rushed inside the building. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. As I entered the lobby, I realized something. I had no idea what was going on. I didn't know who was following me, why they were doing it, or how they seemed to know where I was going at all times. But I did know one thing. I wasn't safe, and whatever was watching me, whatever was following me, wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. The steady hum of the machine as it ascended only made the silence in the small enclosed space more oppressive. I pressed the button for my floor, but the sense of urgency didn't fade. My heart raced, each beat echoing in my ears as I tried to steady my breathing. The building was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of neighbors and traffic distant and muffled. I felt like an intruder in my own home, the weight of something lurking just beyond my awareness pressing down on me. I had barely stepped out of the elevator when I heard the sound, a low, scraping noise, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Habit. I froze. It came from the hallway just ahead, and my pulse quickened. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. I glanced down the corridor, expecting to see a familiar face, but there was no one there. The door to my apartment was just a few steps away, but I couldn't move. Something wasn't right. The dragging noise stopped, and a sudden chill filled the air. It wasn't the kind of cold that comes from a malfunctioning air conditioner or an open window. It was the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones, a cold that seems to seep into your very soul. I couldn't breathe. I felt like the air around me had thickened, as though something was closing in on me from all sides. My body was frozen in place, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I stood there, trapped by an invisible force. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, no, not a figure, but a shape, was moving down the hallway toward me. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form was barely discernible in the low light. It was like it didn't belong in the world, like it was something out of place, something that shouldn't be. Its movements were unnaturally slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring the fear that I could feel rising within me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted for my door, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. Every second felt like an eternity. The sound of footsteps behind me was faint, but I could hear them, growing louder with each passing moment. I was running out of time. Finally, the door clicked open, and I rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop to lock it. I didn't even care. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breath, my heart still pounding in my chest. The apartment was quiet, but I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. It was like the very walls of the room were closing in. I could feel it. the presence of something watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. More life began to flow through me. I didn't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually I forced myself to move. I turned on every light in the apartment, trying to push back the darkness, but it didn't help. The shadows seemed to grow longer, deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in here with me. I tried to distract myself, turning on the TV, flipping through channels, but nothing could take my mind off the strange, creeping sensation that something was wrong. The figure in the hallway, the dragging noise. It all felt too real, too close. My apartment had never felt so suffocating, so alien. The longer I stayed in the apartment, the more I realized that the terror wasn't just from the figure in the hallway. It was something deeper, something far more insidious. It was like I had stepped into a world that didn't make sense, a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. The sedan, the tall figure, the chilling cold, it was all connected, all leading me towards something I couldn't comprehend. The sublimity. I sat down on the couch, trying to gather my thoughts. I needed to figure this out, to understand what was happening to me. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle refused to fit together. It was as if the truth was just beyond my grasp, like there was something I was missing. Suddenly, the phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to answer it. I couldn't. But the ringing continued, louder and more insistent. Reluctantly, I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear nothing but the sound of heavy breathing, slow and deliberate. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you know what you've done?" A voice finally whispered, low and rasping. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but somehow I knew it wasn't a stranger. It was too familiar, too cold. "This way," said Watson, and pointed with his thumb toward the basement. I couldn't speak. I felt paralyzed, my mouth dry, my heart pounding in my chest. "You've awakened something," the voice continued. "And now, it's coming for you." The line went dead, and I was left staring at the phone in disbelief, the weight of the words sinking into me. I had awakened something, and whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had me. The silence that followed the phone call felt deafening. I stood there, still gripping the receiver, staring at the darkened screen as though it might suddenly offer an explanation, a way out of the nightmare that was closing in around me. The words, "It's coming for you," echoed in my mind, replaying over and over again, each repetition sending a new wave of dread through me. When it was Abner's turn, I dropped the phone onto the couch and ran to the windows. The blinds were drawn tight, but I had to see outside, had to reassure myself that the world was still the same. I pushed the blinds aside, peering out into the darkened street below. The lights of the city flickered like distant stars, casting faint shadows over the sidewalks. There was nothing unusual, no figures lurking in the alleys, no strange shapes moving in the distance. But that didn't mean I was safe. The weight in the air, that oppressive feeling of something watching me, hadn't gone away. It lingered, thick and suffocating, crawling along the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just the phone call. It was the entire atmosphere of the apartment. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now felt like they were closing in on me, pressing against me from all sides. I took a step back from the window, my mind racing. What had I done? What did the voice mean when it said I'd awakened something? I couldn't make sense of it. My head spun as I tried to piece together everything that had happened. The sedan, the figure in the hallway, the dragging noise. Everything seemed connected, but the connections were fraying at the edges, slipping through my fingers like sand. I needed answers. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that I wasn't going to find any answers in the apartment. The only thing I was going to find was whatever was waiting for me in the dark corners of this building, in the places I couldn't see. I grabbed my coat and keys, making up my mind in an instant. I had to get out of here. The apartment wasn't safe anymore. The voice on the phone had made that clear. I didn't know what was coming for me, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. The elevator ride down felt just as slow as the ride up, each floor descending with a quiet thud that seemed to reverberate in my bones. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the handrail, trying to steady myself. The feeling of dread was almost unbearable now, like it was hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. When the doors opened, I stepped into the lobby. It was quiet. Too quiet. The building felt deserted. The usual sounds of neighbors coming and going absent. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to shift with every movement. Always in the back of my mind was the thought that my imagination had placed in the gallery, having read about it on a website. I walked briskly toward the front door, but as I reached for the handle, a sudden thought stopped me cold. I turned around, walking down the hallway again, each step slower than the last. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't leave without confronting whatever had been lurking there. The air in the hallway felt heavier this time, more oppressive. It was like I was walking into a trap, and I couldn't stop myself. As I neared the end of the hall, I saw it again. The shadow. It was darker than before, stretching across the floor like a living thing. It seemed to pulse, moving in a way that defied logic, as if it was breathing, as if it was alive. I froze, unable to move. My body screamed for me to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor, unwilling to obey. The shadow shifted, and from the darkness emerged a figure. A tall, slender silhouette that seemed to distort the space around it. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring my fear. I couldn't see its face, but I felt it, the weight of its gaze, the cold, suffocating presence that seemed to crawl beneath my skin. It was getting closer, its steps slow but steady, dragging the darkness along with it. I could feel it, like a physical force pushing against me. I backed away, but it didn't matter. It was too late. A voice, not from the phone, but from the figure itself, rasped in the silence. "You should have left when you had the chance." The air grew colder, the shadows deepening, and in that moment I knew. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the cold tile of the hallway. The sound of the figure's slow, measured steps echoed behind me, but I couldn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I reached the elevator and slammed the button to call it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely press it. The doors slid open, and I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, the doors closing behind me with a soft thud. But even as the elevator descended, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that the thing was still out there, waiting, watching, and that no matter how far I ran, it would follow. The elevator seemed to move at an excruciatingly slow pace. Every second stretched into eternity as I stood there, trying to steady my breath. The quiet hum of the machinery was the only sound in the small, claustrophobic space, and it only served to heighten the oppressive silence that surrounded me. I glanced at the display above the door, watching the floors count down one by one. 8, 7, 6. The elevator was taking its sweet time. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt something gnawing at the edges of my mind. That same sensation, the one that had been creeping up on me ever since the first phone call, was back. It was as if the walls of the elevator had become too thin, as though something was pressing in on me from all sides. The lights above flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely. I gasped, my heart leaping into my throat. The elevator plunged into darkness. My breath caught in my chest, and I fumbled for the emergency button, my fingers trembling as I reached out blindly. But nothing happened. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across my skin as I tried to steady myself, trying to fight back the rising panic. I wasn't alone in here. I could feel it, the presence, that ever-encroaching, suffocating weight. And then, from the darkness, came the whisper. "Did you think you could escape?" I froze. The voice, low, distorted, like it was coming from the depths of the earth, was unmistakable. It was the same voice from the phone call, the same one that had sent me spiraling into this nightmare. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only feel the overwhelming terror coursing through my veins, like ice in my blood. The elevator jerked to a stop, the sudden motion almost knocking me off my feet. The doors slid open with a creak, revealing the dimly lit lobby. But it wasn't the same lobby I had left moments ago. The walls seemed to have shifted, the hallway extending unnaturally far. The shadows in the corners were darker, deeper, as if they had been waiting for me. I stumbled out of the elevator, my mind racing. Something was wrong. This wasn't the building I had left behind. The familiar layout had been twisted, distorted. I had crossed some invisible boundary, and now I was trapped in a place that felt alien, unrecognizable. I turned down the hallway, the oppressive silence following me like a shadow. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the stillness, every sound amplified in the unnatural quiet. The walls seemed to close in on me with each step, and I could feel the cold presence at my back, always there, just out of sight. As I walked, I began to notice the doors. They were all closed, but something about them felt wrong. The numbers on the doors were smudged, illegible. Some of the doors were warped, their edges buckled and uneven, as if they had been here for years, untouched by time. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the lights flickering above like dying stars. And then I saw it. At the end of the hall, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body a silhouette against the darkness. Its shape was distorted, as if it were made of shadows itself, bending and shifting with every passing second. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. "Why are you still here?" The voice came again, now more insistent, more commanding. "You should have left." I took a step back, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The fear that gripped me was paralyzing. My body refused to obey, my legs trembling as I fought to move, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. I could hear it now, the sound of something dragging, something heavy scraping against the floor. It was coming closer, and with it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to reverberate in my bones. It was the same dragging noise I had heard earlier, the one that had followed me through the hallways. Only now it was louder, closer, as if it were right behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there, just the oppressive silence, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whisper came again, closer this time, like it was right in my ear. "Run, if you can." And then, with a sudden burst of energy, I turned and bolted down the hallway. My feet pounded against the floor, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear the dragging sound behind me, gaining on me with every step. I wasn't fast enough. It was getting closer, closer. I reached the stairs and didn't hesitate. I ran up them 2 at a time, the heavy thud of my footsteps mingling with the dragging sound, a cacophony of fear and desperation. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what I was running from. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. But the farther I went, the more distorted the building became. The stairs twisted, the walls seemed to shift, and I could feel the very air around me warping, like the building itself was alive, moving in ways it shouldn't. And then, as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. A door. It was different from the others. It was made of old weathered wood, its edges worn down by time. It was ajar, just slightly, as though inviting me in. Without thinking, I pushed it open. What lay beyond was not the hallway I had expected. Instead, it was a room. A dark, empty room, with walls that seemed to stretch infinitely into the shadows. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. Hops. The room was vast, too vast. It felt as if the walls stretched endlessly into the darkness, their outlines disappearing into an abyss that had no beginning or end. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen, the weight of the silence pressing down on me like a physical force. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could taste the stale, musty scent that filled the space. It was a room that should not exist, a place that defied the very logic of reality. I tried to move, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Every step was a struggle, as though the room itself was resisting my presence. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. The whispers were gone, replaced by the eerie stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. But the feeling of being watched, never left. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the cold, smooth surface of the nearest wall. It was solid, but it felt wrong. It didn't belong here. There was something about the texture, something unsettling in its smoothness, as though it was artificial, not a part of this world. I turned, hoping to find an exit, but there was nothing. No door, no windows, no way out. The room seemed to swallow up any hope of escape, leaving me with nothing but the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my mind. Derek smiled, and then from the darkness I heard it again, the dragging sound. Closer this time. Louder. I spun around, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the silence, the heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to stretch on forever. My heart raced as I strained to hear, to understand what was happening, but the dragging sound continued, drawing closer, until it felt as though it was right behind me. I whirled around, my breath shallow, my body trembling. There was nothing, only the vast emptiness of the room. I was alone, but I wasn't. The sound came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just dragging, it was scraping, clawing, as though something was desperately trying to reach me from the other side of the room. I took a step back, my eyes wide, my pulse racing in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it now. Something that shouldn't be there. And then I saw it. A figure. It emerged from the shadows, its shape flickering in and out of existence like a bad signal on a television. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, too thin. Its body was a silhouette against the dark, its edges constantly shifting and distorting as though it was made of smoke. It had no face, just a void where its features should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to obey, frozen in place as the figure moved closer, its form twisting with every step. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, as though it was closing in on me, hungry for something I couldn't comprehend. "Why did you come back?" The voice, low, distorted, and unrecognizable, filled the room, sending a chill down my spine. It wasn't the same voice I had heard before. This one was deeper, more guttural, as though it came from somewhere far beneath the earth. Glory! I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to respond. My mind screamed at me to flee, to escape this nightmare, but the terror that gripped me held me in place, unable to move. The counselor answered. The figure stepped closer, its form warping, its limbs elongating unnaturally as it reached for me. I could feel the coldness emanating from it, a bone-deep chill that seemed to freeze everything it touched. I could hear the scraping sound now, right behind me, as if something else was closing in from the other side, drawing nearer, growing more desperate. And then, as if on cue, the figure stopped. It was only a few feet away now, but it made no move to advance. Instead, it stood there, its distorted shape shifting and flickering like a shadow in the dark, its presence suffocating. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. It was watching, waiting. I wanted to run, to break free from this nightmare, but the fear was too overwhelming. I was trapped, caught in the suffocating grip of this place. And then, the voice spoke again. But this time, it was different. Do you hear them? I didn't understand. Do you hear the echoes of those who have come before you? The voice was mocking now, its tone cruel and twisted. They're all here, in this room, lost forever, and you will join them. The figure's form shifted, stretching and twisting in impossible ways. The walls seemed to bend, and the room grew colder. The silence was replaced by the faint sound of whispers, voices, distant and disembodied, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. They grew louder, more frantic, until the room was filled with the cacophony of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. I clutched my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was useless. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere. Inside my head, around me, above me, below me. They were everywhere. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard it. A single, clear voice, cutting through the noise like a knife. Run. I didn't hesitate. My legs moved before my brain could process the command. I ran, stumbling through the darkness, desperate to escape the suffocating grip of the room. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to drag me back into the abyss. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. All that mattered was getting out, escaping whatever nightmare this was. I ran and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the emptiness, until finally I reached something. A door. I didn't stop to think. I threw it open. The door slammed open and I stumbled through it, my body trembling with the force of the escape. For a moment, I stood in the threshold, gasping for air, unsure if I had truly left the room or if it was just another part of the twisted nightmare. The world outside the door was blurry, as though I had just crossed a veil, leaving the horrors behind me. But the unsettling silence followed me, pressing in on all sides. I was no longer in that vast, empty space. I was back in the hallway, the familiar surroundings of the building where it all started. The hallway was dimly lit, with only the faint hum of overhead lights breaking the oppressive quiet. The walls, once clean and sterile, now appeared to be decaying, the paint peeling in places, revealing the raw, crumbling structure beneath. But it was still the same place. I could hear my own breath, shallow and rapid, as I looked around, my mind racing. How could I have returned? I had escaped, hadn't I? I took a step forward, then another, each movement heavy, like wading through thick mud. The sense of dread that had gripped me in the room was still there, clinging to my skin, refusing to let go. I had to leave this place. I had to get out before it swallowed me whole. But something wasn't right. I paused, staring down the hallway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The door behind me, the one I had just fled through, was now closed. The faint sound of scratching echoed from the other side. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge that the horrors might still be there, lurking just beyond threshold. I forced myself to turn away, my footsteps quickening as I moved further down the hallway. The dim light flickered, casting long, stretching shadows along the walls. The whispers, the same ones I had heard before, began to return, barely audible at first, then louder with each passing second. "Run," the voice had told me. But where? There was no escape. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, a never-ending maze of rooms and corridors that all looked the same. I felt the walls closing in on me, the air growing thick with a sense of inevitability. The elemental couldn't breathe. The weight of it all was suffocating. The whispers turned into voices, then into screams, and I clutched my head in agony, desperate to block them out. "Please," I whispered to myself. "Please, let me wake up." But I wasn't asleep. This was real. This nightmare was my reality now. I reached for the nearest door, hoping for something, anything that would lead me out of this madness. My hands shook as I grasped the cold handle, and with a forceful twist, the door opened. Inside was a room I didn't recognize. It was small, dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in places, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. But what caught my attention was the figure sitting in the corner of the room, facing away from me. It was him, the delivery boy, the boy who had been the first to disappear, the one whose face I had never seen, whose voice had never reached my ears. He sat motionless in the corner, his back to me, his posture stiff and unnatural. He didn't move as I stepped into the room, the door creaking shut behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. What was he doing here? How could he be here? I took a cautious step forward, my breath catching in my throat. Are you real?" I asked, my voice trembling. There was no answer. I stepped closer, my feet dragging against the worn floorboards until I was standing just a few feet away from him. The boy didn't turn around. He remained completely still, his hands resting on his lap, his head lowered as if he were lost in thought. I reached out, my fingers brushing against his shoulder, and suddenly he turned. His face, it wasn't a face at all, just a smooth, featureless expanse of skin, like a blank canvas. His eyes, if they existed, were gone, replaced by two hollow voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. His mouth was open, but there was no sound, no scream, no cry, just an endless, yawning emptiness. I recoiled, stumbling back, my mind struggling to comprehend the impossible horror before me. The boy was gone, but the room remained, and the silence returned, heavier than before. The walls seemed to close in on me, the floor beneath my feet buckling as if the very building was collapsing inward. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched out before me, longer than I remembered, the lights flickering as I sprinted down the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to escape. I had to get out of here. I reached the end of the hallway, and before me stood another door. I didn't hesitate. I threw it open, and the door creaked open, revealing a room that was strangely familiar. It was the same room, the same walls, the same cold, lifeless atmosphere. The walls were cracked, the floor was covered in dust, and the faintest hint of a musty smell lingered in the air. But something was different. The room felt... I was trapped again. I spun around, searching for an exit, but the walls seemed to close in on me. The room was shifting, contorting, its dimensions warping as if reality itself was being bent. The whispers, soft at first, began to rise again, swirling around me, growing louder, more insistent. They were no longer distant, no longer just words. They were voices, screams, and they were calling my name. "Help me," a voice sobbed. "Please, help me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice sounded so familiar, but I couldn't place it. I couldn't remember where I had heard it before. Who is it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and I spun toward it, my heart racing. The shape was growing, taking form. It was the boy, the delivery boy, but this time he was different. His blank, featureless face was gone, replaced by something even more terrifying. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to devour everything around them. His mouth was stretched into a grotesque, unnatural grin, and his body was distorted, twisted, as if it had been broken and reassembled in some horrific way. He stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. The air around him seemed to shimmer, warping and bending, as if reality itself was struggling to hold together. "Please," the voice whispered again, closer now. "Help me." I took a step back, my pulse racing. I knew what was coming. I had seen this before, felt it before. The boy was a reflection of everything I had tried to escape, a manifestation of my fear, my guilt, my inability to break free from the horrors of this place. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No more. I won't do this again." The boy's grin widened, stretching impossibly wide, and he let out a low, guttural laugh that echoed in the room. The walls began to close in, the floor buckling beneath my feet, as if the very room itself was consuming me. But then something shifted. A light. A soft, golden glow began to pulse from the corner of the room. At first it was faint, barely noticeable, but as I focused on it, the light grew brighter, warmer. It wasn't a light from any bulb or source I could identify. It was something else, something otherworldly. I felt the weight in my chest ease, the pressure in my head lift. The whispers started to fade, replaced by a gentle hum, almost like a lullaby. I turned toward the light, my eyes narrowing, my breath coming easier. The boy was still there, but he was no longer moving. His twisted form was frozen in place, his grin now a faint, haunting echo. The room was changing, the oppressive atmosphere lifting, as if the very essence of fear was being purged from the space, or a healing. I stepped forward, cautiously at first, then more confidently. The light was pulling me in, urging me to come closer. With each step, I felt lighter, as if I was being freed from the nightmare that had gripped me for so long. The boy's face shifted, the black pits of his eyes now filled with something else. Something human. The darkness seemed to lift from him, and for the briefest moment I saw his face. The delivery boy, not as a monster, but as a boy. Scared, lost, and alone. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice soft and clear. "Thank you for bringing me home." The room was silent. The light pulsed once more, and then, like a wave retreating from the shore, it began to fade, leaving only the soft glow of a distant memory. The boy's form began to dissolve, melting into the air like smoke, his presence fading away as if he had never been there at all. The walls of the room stopped shifting. The floor steadied beneath my feet. The oppressive weight of fear that had once consumed me was gone. The door behind me opened slowly, its creak gentle and inviting. I turned toward it, my heart still racing but no longer in terror. I stepped into the hallway, my legs weak but my mind clearer than it had been in ages. I wasn't free from fear. I wasn't free from the memories that haunted me. But I had learned something. The darkness, The fear, the twisted horrors, they could be faced. They could be overcome. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope. The door closed softly behind me as I stepped into the light, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the echoes of the forgotten woods fade into silence.